Chapter 1 of The Storyteller of Pain by Loren Molloy. Chapter 1. Don't you see I am a map of scars? Under this skin, under this flesh, a book of scars tells the story of my life. I am like a patchwork quilt, but nothing so pretty or so neat. Each scar is a story. Each story leads to another scar and another story. The story is never complete. It will never be complete. I am the storyteller of pain. That's nice, Mrs. Delacour, but I asked you how you slept last night. The psychiatrist looked at the woman sitting in the chair across from her. Mrs. Delacour was mid-40s, came from a good family, and was dropped off at the sanitarium 3 nights ago. The family was powerful and wealthy. They simply couldn't afford to be seen with a lunatic for a family member, so they signed her over to the sanitarium for safekeeping. Mrs. Delacour had repeated the same thing to any question she was asked. Don't you see I'm a map of scars? Dr. Sinclair had been head psychiatrist there for the last 7 years. In all those years, she had never been so puzzled as she had been with Mrs. Delacour. The history given showed neither signs for hysteria nor any psychosis. No signs of trauma or abuse seemed present. She has had patients who rambled things plenty of times before. She's even had patients who seemed to just crack one day and never returned. This was different. Lillian had never felt this before. She knew she couldn't base things on her feelings or emotions, but she never felt like this before with a patient. Lillian had been in rooms with murderers, rapists, and madmen alike, but she was never scared, only fascinated and professional. Delia Delacour was different. Lillian couldn't explain it, but from the moment Delia spoke, Lillian had goosebumps appear on her flesh, and a chill flew up her spine. Delia's eyes looked dead. Her voice sounded empty, cold, and raspy. The only word she could think of was haunted. It was a look of horror, of seeing too much for the mind to handle, a nightmare that would never stop replaying before the person's eyes. Waking or asleep made no difference. Mrs. Delacour was stuck in an endless loop of horror. Whatever she saw, whatever happened to her, it was bad, very bad. Her skin was pasty, pale, and clammy. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, fear-ridden, and yet somehow looked dead and lifeless at the same time. Mrs. Delacour seemed like a marionette that only came alive when it was time to say her little speech. She was like a pull toy with only one message. Ask a question, and an invisible hand pulled an invisible cord somewhere deep inside her, and suddenly she had lifelike movements and speech. When her message finished its recording, she would go back to a lifeless-looking marionette. It was disturbing, to say at least. All Dr. Sinclair could think was, what could make a person become like that? This had been their first therapy session since the intake when she was admitted. It was the standard 48-hour observation in confinement. It was during that time the staff decided it would be best for Mrs. Delacour to stay in confined quarters indefinitely. The next morning after Mrs. Delacour arrived, the staff told Lillian that putting that woman in with general population would be a terrible idea. Anything other than confined quarters would be detrimental to the rest of the patients and would become a dangerous situation for everyone involved. Dr. Sinclair asked what brought them to this conclusion so quickly. She was told by the head nurse that the moment they put Mrs. Delacour into observation, the patients in the rooms around her began to get extremely agitated and violent towards themselves. The fear was palpable, and the screams were deafening. It wasn't until they removed the rest of the patients, one by one, into different rooms away from Mrs. Delacour, that the patients settled down at all. Delia herself didn't move from the spot on the cot they placed her on at all. She just sat there, not moving a muscle, except to speak her message over and over again. When they checked on her in the morning, she was still in the same spot, same position, saying the same thing. Delia never slept, not once in that time. It baffled Dr. Sinclair to hear of such extreme reactions from the other patients without Delia needing to do anything to stir them up. Dr. Sinclair just stared at her patient for several moments. It had now been 3 days, and Delia had still not slept. The Veronal milligrams had been upped for the 3rd time in 3 days. If this barbital medication doesn't work to knock Delia into slumberland, then she would be the first person in the hospital's history to not have this medication work. It's what all the patients at Danvers Lunatic Asylum are given at bedtime. Once, they had to up the dose for one of the male patients, but he was 6'7", tall, and weighed almost 350 pounds. Upping his dosage only made sense, the right milligrams for the person's weight. Mrs. Delacour was not by any means a massive individual, and 5 times the recommended dosage was unheard of. Lillian prayed this time it worked, because otherwise she wasn't sure what medicine to prescribe for sleep that would actually work for her. Delia just sat there motionless, staring at Lillian. The feeling was very unnerving, to say the least. Chills of fear ran up and down Lillian's body. She now understood completely why the staff and other patients felt so fearful of this woman. A sickening lump of ice was forming in Lillian's stomach. No matter what question she asked, Delia began her same monologue. It was very frustrating to Dr. Sinclair. She even tried letting Delia finish her whole message, and then asked, "But why are you suddenly the storyteller of pain?" The reply was the same speech started all over again. Never a word was chosen differently than the time before. It seemed to be a memorized speech, one that seemed to delete all other information from her being. It was just so frustrating. It was like a recording with only one message. Where did the rest of the recording go? Where did Delia go if this is all that's left? Lillian thought. Delia certainly was acting extremely dysfunctional. As for her lack of sleep, if they can't find something that will knock her out, her health will become seriously endangered. Finally, her appointment with Delia was over. Lillian learned nothing new about Delia, nor did she learn anything new about the woman's pathology. How does a high-class woman like Mrs. Delacour go from a radiant light and sheer delight in social circles to this pull toy? At first, Lillian thought it could have been caused by a delayed, nervous breakdown after hearing the news that Delia's husband died overseas. Alas, that couldn't have been the case. As it turned out, it happened over 1.5 years ago. The family said she grieved for many months before showing her face again in society. She seemed to be in relatively good spirits after the grieving process was over. It also wouldn't explain her bizarre behavior. A loss of a loved one has never caused this kind of a reaction from someone. Lillian felt completely stumped by this case. Her meeting with Delia didn't illuminate the situation at all. The feelings she got for Delia were not normal either. Lillian, in fact, didn't feel like herself after the meeting. Pure fear flooded her system throughout the whole meeting. It took all Lillian's strength not to show her fear to her patient. She was truly grateful when the session was finally over and a nurse came and took Mrs. Delacour back to her room. Now that Lillian was alone, she felt sick to her stomach and had a massive migraine. She felt extremely out of sorts. Maybe it was because this case just didn't make any logical sense. Lillian sat in her office, completely puzzled, staring out the window that overlooked the grounds. Barkley, the night guardsman, startled her almost out of her skin when he turned the light on in her office. She had sat there pondering what to do with this bizarre case for so long and so deeply. She didn't notice nighttime had crept up on her. She was sitting in complete darkness. "Holy shit, Doc! You scared the crap out of me! What are you doing sitting in pitch darkness? I would have knocked if I seen a light on." Lillian had always seen him in fleeting moments leaving the building. Nothing more than a hello and goodbye was ever exchanged before this moment. Lillian found herself realizing she'd never really noticed him before. She took advantage of this moment to really look at him. Barkley had been in his late 30s. He was in amazing shape and had the kind of build and tan a man only gets from daily hard work outdoors. Lily guessed he was around 6'4", and realized she was just gawking at him with her mouth open. Barkley started to blush a bit and chuckled. More gently, he said, "You okay, Doc? You don't seem like your usual self, if you don't mind me saying, ma'am." Lillian blinked a bunch of times. The ma'am seemed to wake her from whatever hold she was under. Embarrassed, she chuckled at him and said, "I'm sorry. You scared me also. I'm all right. I guess I just got lost in thought and time ran away from me again. Sorry I scared you, Barkley. Wasn't intentional. I also realized you've worked here 2 years now, and I know nothing about you. Seems terribly rude of me. I don't even know your first name." Lillian just realized she was flirting with the night watchman. It was very unlike her, and there she was trying to make it less awkward. Epic fail once again, Lily, she thought. Barkley took a step into the room and smiled. "It's John. John Barkley. I can't blame you for that. I only work the night shift. You're usually gone already when I get here, or just leaving." Lily liked the sound of his voice. It was nice. It somehow matched his sun-kissed chestnut wave of hair and sea-green eyes. When he smiled, one side of his mouth hitched up higher, showing a dimple in his left cheek that caused his whole face to make her heart melt. That thought stopped her in her tracks. That mushy shit is so not her style. Something was wrong. Trying to bring things back to a professional place, she looked down at her books and asked, "What made you become a night guard here? It's obvious you're not from here. From your muscular physique and that delicious tan, I can tell you spend a large amount of time doing some form of manual labor outdoors." She stopped again. The pen in her hand dropped. She was making little heart doodles. Damn it! That was worse than the last time she opened her mouth. She couldn't believe she actually said delicious tan. What the fuck is wrong with her? When she looked up, she was red from embarrassment. John had a huge, dazzling smile on his dreamy face. He said, "Well, you're right, Doc. I'm not from here. I was a police officer in New Orleans until about 4 years ago. A drug bust went bad. A rookie thought he didn't need his team or the plan. Fucker went in like he was some ridiculous Western movie. He died. 3 other officers also died. I got severely wounded. I was told I was lucky to be alive. I was in the hospital for 6 months. Must have had damn near 9 surgeries to fix all the damage done to me. All 'cause some kid thought he was the Lone fucking Ranger. After physical therapy and rehabilitation, I got the heck out of that state and far away from those memories. Honestly, I knew I couldn't escape the memories, but I also knew I needed to get away from all the reminders. I couldn't drive in that town or walk any of those streets afterwards, so I came here. With my background, I got hired as a guard, and yes, pretty lady, I work on a construction crew several days a week building houses. I hardly slept when I was on the force. Not going to suddenly start now, John said. She just sat there silently and blinked at him again. John took another step into the room. You sure you're okay? You want me to walk you to your car, Doc?" Lily knew that was a very bad idea. She didn't trust herself to walk or talk at first, and just shook her head. John took another step toward her out of concern. She had to get out of there before this became something out of a ridiculous, trashy romance novel. "No, I'm fine. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Barkley, and thank you for sharing your story with me. I must go now. I'll lock up when I'm done. You have a good evening." From the tone, it was an obvious dismissal. It was John's turn to freeze and just start to blink at her. The massive switch she had just made towards him confused John completely. He went from Barkley to John to Mr. Barkley within the same conversation. She didn't even go back to the usual Barkley. No, now he was Mr. Barkley. That's always the problem. Nothing can ever go back to the way that things were before. That's always the problem. Nothing can ever go back to the way things were before. Now he was Mr. Barkley, who was suddenly being dismissed like a child or a lowly subject. John sighed inwardly and thought, women. Yes, Dr. Sinclair. You get home safely now. I enjoyed talking with you, Dr. Sinclair. He turned his back on her and headed towards the door, leaving his sarcasm heavy in the air. He turned back to her once more from the doorway. She looked hurt, confused, and completely mortified. He suddenly felt so guilty and sighed outwardly. He leaned against the doorway and looked at her again. Her chin was even trembling. John suddenly realized she was a whole heck of a lot younger than he originally thought. He never got a good look at her before this. She was always walking away from him, with her head stuck in a case file. She seemed older somehow then. He thought she was late 30s easily, but now, studying her, he realized he was way off. She had to be mid or late 20s. If she was over 30 at all, he'd eat his hat. Damn, he whispered. What? She asked hostilely, trying desperately to act cold, aloof, and in control of the situation. John could truly see her now. The act wasn't working anymore with him. She was scared and worried. It was obvious to him suddenly that she desperately needed someone to talk with. All John could think was, a beauty like her should have plenty of friends or a man of her own. It was clear to him neither were true for Lillian. She's all alone with no one to talk to and had no idea how to interact with normal people. Her job was her life. John knew from experience what happens when all you have is a job and nothing else. It's a sad and lonely life. John sighed again at this revelation. He recrossed his legs and arms and leaned against the doorway once more. It was pointless, except she was watching every move he made. She liked him, he could tell. She was very attracted to him, and it was obvious by the color that flushed in her cheeks at his every movement. Listen, kitten. In Louisiana, I worked complex, difficult, sometimes fucked up cases. I don't scare that easily. So, sweetheart, if you ever want to talk about whatever it is that's worrying you so much, I'm here. No, I'm not some fancy shrink with a bunch of degrees, but sometimes a different point of view helps. Sometimes just having someone to talk to about it helps. John smirked at her a little bit. It was such a shrink line to use on her, he just couldn't help smirking. He looked at her, his face turning serious, and said, in all seriousness, though, don't let this place or people get a hold of you. Sometimes there's just a darkness rooted in deep. Sometimes there's no answer, and if you don't let go of that poisonous puzzle, it'll poison you. So saith my shrink in New Orleans. He had his hand raised, palm towards the sky in mock contrition. He chuckled again. He took his time removing himself from the wall. He loved her reaction to him. When he was finally standing fully upright, he stretched, raising his arms wide overhead, and yawned for a few seconds. He wanted her to get one last real good look at that delicious tan and amazing physique she spoke of before she went Arctic on him. By the time he was done with his little show, Lillian was completely flushed with desire. John thought, good, Mr. Barkley out. Smiling at his private little joke, he strolled out of the room without another look back. Lillian just sat frozen in her office chair for several long minutes, trying to gather her wits and figure out what the hell just happened to her. She's always so professional. She lived by the rule, you don't shit where you eat. Now she made a fool out of herself to a very hot man who'll be here every night. Ugh, those never end well. Nope. It becomes one fucked up, awkward nightmare, spending the rest of my pathetic life trying to leave the hospital before he gets in for his shift. That never works forever. Oh. Lillian felt nauseous at the thought of dealing with that nonsense forever. Yuck. She stood gathering the papers and files she wanted to study whenever she finally got home from this hellish, dragged-out day. End of Chapter 1 of The Storyteller of Pain by Loren Molloy.